So, good morning and welcome to Dartford and Gravesham's Pride 2022 podcasts. I'm Guy, as you all know. Today, I am delighted to be interviewing an old friend and colleague of mine. We are very lucky to be joined by Dr. Tristan Barber. Tristan works as a HIV physician at the Royal Free Hospital. He is also the chair of the Education and Communication Committee for the British HIV Association and is chair of the board of the trustees for Positively UK. Tristan, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great delight to be with you, Guy.
So we're running a series of podcasts this year as part of our organisational Pride 22 celebrations and awareness campaign. And we're talking to a series of fantastic speakers about their experiences of being openly LGBTQ plus, both as a service user and patient, but also as working within the NHS. So Tristan, you started your medical career, I think, back in 1992 at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, and we actually both met there. So our careers have intertwined over many years. Tell me what were your experiences of being openly gay in the 90s as a medical student?
Thanks, Guy. I mean, you're much younger than me, so I don't think I met you until 1994. But yes, it was back in the early 90s indeed. I found medical school a bit shocking, I have to be honest. I had moved from Cornwall at the age of 17, and I was someone who'd been openly out at school for about 3 years by that point, and had a very established group of friends who mostly identified as heterosexual at the time, but we were all very comfortable with each other. And I was excited about moving to London, thinking, of course, that I was moving to a fantastic, cosmopolitan, diverse city with many opportunities. But I think in some ways at that point, medical school remained quite an institutionalized small village. I hope some of that has changed because most of those standalone medical schools have, of course, now merged with larger academic institutions with many different departments and faculties. But at the time, it felt like quite a small, occasionally very homophobic village. And some of that was very uncomfortable. And I felt really sometimes unwelcome in social spaces and very much sort of asked to go and have my social life elsewhere in more established gay venues within the city. And I think I wanted to do that as well. But I also, of course, wanted to have some university life. I have to admit, I took a year off after my first year. And when I came back into the year that was then yours, in general, things already felt a little bit more inclusive and better. And things did definitely improve over time. But I think I found the initial impact of medical school quite shocking.
Okay, and homophobia in all education environments is clearly destructive, but it often seems to get just pushed aside as it's a bit of banter. It's teenagers just being teenagers, and actually I think it's really destructive. How did how do those experiences? How did it affect you? How do you think it affects other students?
I think there was, for a large number of people actually, who felt different. I think it was hard to find your place at medical school back in the early 90s. And we know people who obviously left medical school for various reasons. And I think it meant that if you had any element of imposter syndrome, and many of us, particularly those of us from non-medical backgrounds, will find that we want to find our feet at medical school and feel included. And I think if there's an environment where that is difficult or not possible, then actually academically your feeling of a slight imposter syndrome may also suffer. So I certainly questioned whether medicine was the right career for me. And as I've said, took some time out. And when I came back, definitely felt in the right place and thrived. much more obviously, I think, than I had done in my initial first year. I'd also found there was an organisation which still exists today, actually, the Gay and Lesbian Association of Doctors and Dentists, which at the time did have a number of social events, mainly happening in grand houses of consultants, so across London, so it gave you something to aspire to.
I remember them well.
And actually, forming a network there, not only of medical students who also attended those events, but also of seeing that there were other LGBT people in senior medical positions, was hugely encouraging. So I think that positive role modeling had an immense impact.
And do you think it's the same today in medical schools, in any form of education establishment that really are supporting the future clinicians and allied health professionals? Do you think it's the same, or do you think we've moved on?
I think we've moved on dramatically. I mean, I have two sisters who are teachers. One teaches at the school I attended, and most issues of sexuality now have evolved so dramatically, even in young people, with their understanding, acceptance, and tolerance of diversity, that I think this continues into university. And I think there have been dramatic changes in medical schools and universities as well. As you will know, a lot of the current discussion in schools, and I'm sure again in higher educational establishments, is around gender identity and becoming even more inclusive with regard to people who have diverse gender identity. And so I think there have been dramatic changes that have happened. I think also there are more visible LGBTQ plus doctors out and about within different fields of medicine. Certainly within my own field of sexual health and HIV, it's been a very comfortable space to be in as someone who identifies as a gay man. But I see a number of gay or queer identifying colleagues in other specialties now on social media, and also in physical reality, particularly in acute medicine and geriatrics and anesthetics and psychiatry, coming to mind immediately. But also I've seen people identifying as gay who are now becoming surgeons, and this is something that may have not felt accessible to me when I was at medical school or when I was a junior doctor. So I think things really have changed in a positive way.
No, I agree completely. I think in the education environment things have moved on. I suppose from my perspective, I'm concerned, and I'm less sure that same advance has been made within the NHS itself. So we people are coming through the education environment and out into the big world of the NHS as a radiographer, as a physiotherapist, as a doctor, as a nurse. And you're lucky to be working in a large metropolitan city. We're a little bit more out in the sticks here. But one of our interesting statistics that I am aware of. So we probably should be thinking around 8% of our workforce would identify as LGBTQ+. But on our staff surveys, we're regularly hitting 1%. Mm-hmm. So it sort of suggests to me that the environments that we're working in aren't quite as open and inclusive as we think they are. Mm-hmm. What are your? I mean, you clearly you chose to go into HIV medicine because of a love of HIV medicine. But I wonder, is there more to it than that? Is it a safe place for people who are openly gay or transgender to work in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually avoided working in HIV about 3 times because I thought it was too obvious a career choice for a gay man. Actually, at the time, I thought I wanted to do something a bit more acute. My initial first sort of post house officer year, as it was then, as opposed to foundation year post, was in obstetrics and gynecology, and I actually loved labour ward, but really early on identified that I was not going to be a surgeon and that I wouldn't get through the obs and gynae training, and then thought about other careers for about 2 years and actually ended up in a gum HIV job because I had a 6-month gap before I started a training post and there was a vacancy. And of course, my own prejudices actually had clouded my judgment, because the ward I was covering at Bart's at the time was full of mostly late diagnosed Africans with HIV, as opposed to gay men, which had been my experience more of seeing HIV services in West London. And of course, that medicine was fascinating and involved a lot of acute decision making. And at that point, I realized that actually I'd been avoiding probably my calling, as it were, for too long. But also the first sexual health job you do, it does feel like a natural environment for someone who has not felt maybe natural in other specialties within medicine. I have to say, what happens very often now is we see junior doctors have quite a lot of boundary issues when they come into sexual health, because I feel lucky that I'm now 47 and have boundary issues that hopefully are established and professional and senior. But when you're in your late 20s and you've found medicine quite difficult and you've never really found a niche or a home, and you're suddenly in a very diverse environment talking about sex and gender and sexuality quite freely, and as someone who in their late 20s or early 30s perhaps is still very sociable and out and about, it can be difficult seeing people your age, or perhaps from your own social groups or communities, and you see some people that really do get very excited to have found that home and that niche. But yeah, it definitely is somewhere where it's comfortable to be diverse. And I guess the kind of grand example of that at the moment is 56 Dean Street in Soho, where when you work there, it's tremendously exciting to be in the centre of London, running cutting edge, innovative services for all sorts of communities and of diversity, and they're leading the way really in developing trans services, for instance, and attract a number of transgendered staff as a consequence. And so I think it really does feel like a natural home. But really, the positive thing for me is that we're now seeing LGBTQ plus people in all areas of medicine. I think I'm trying to think of anywhere that's not true. I even saw someone recently who was embarking on training as an orthopedic surgeon from that community, and I thought, wow, that is something that's tremendously changed. I would not have thought of orthopedics as a welcoming career for me 20 years ago.
I think perhaps even 5 years ago. Although I am lucky to work with some very metrosexual orthopedic surgeons in my organisation who I would consider as friends. I'm just going to bring you back a little bit. So you said you thought about obs and gynae, and then you realised you weren't going to cut it as a surgeon. Is that because you felt that it wasn't the subject for you? You didn't like being in the operating theatre, or was there homophobia there that influenced making those decisions?
No, it was the former, actually. In fact, in that job, I didn't feel I experienced homophobia, and there were some out gay obs and gynae consultants. Okay. So no, I didn't. It was not a homophobic driven decision. Okay. It was a skill set decision, definitely.
Okay. And then in the rest of your career, do you think there are times? Can you recall times in your career after medical school that you've been made to feel uncomfortable because of your sexuality, or uncomfortable in an environment because people didn't know your sexuality?
I think the thing that's become apparent to me as I get older is that I increasingly haven't, as time has moved on, I've not felt uncomfortable because of my sexuality. What has changed, and I think this is where we must all maintain empathy, is that I have a number of characteristics that are associated with certain privileges. I'm a white cisgendered man, and of course many other people do not come from positions where those privileges may be things that protect them slightly in medical environments, but nonetheless, I think testimony about finding things difficult is tremendously important. My friend Rageshri Darawan wrote a piece in the BMJ, a blog piece about testimonial injustice, which was a way of reframing imposter syndrome. And I think it's tremendously important because even with certain aspects of privilege, my path through medicine has not been an easy one. And therefore, opportunities like this, I think, to discuss that are important, because there may be recognizable barriers, obstacles, and ways of overcoming those that other people may benefit from.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying with the how we are externally viewed. Similar to you, to the majority of people, I look like a white middle class man, and I try and do a lot of work to support our wider EDI communities. But I do look, that's how people first greet you, and I'm sure you do the same. Well, this is only recording today, but I can see that, in your work environment, you're happy to wear quite a flamboyant shirt. I think we both wear badges that would identify ourselves to being a safe person to talk to about gender issues and gender identity and sexuality. So it's about that openly, how we present ourselves. And can I ask, so as a leader in LGBTQ visibility in the NHS, how important do you think it is for people like yourself, like me, who are senior enough to be able to stand out? How important do you think it for us to push that agenda, that visibility forward?
I think it's tremendously important. Of course, what we really want to do is make sure those who feel least able to speak out openly about these things are in environments where they feel comfortable to do so. And certainly I've experienced that, when teaching in clinic, when having medical students who may, again, have been struggling or not finding things very easy, often conversations come out that are more about their pastoral care and well-being than about the subject that's involved in teaching. And I think it's tremendously important to keep doing that. We must always remember that people will be on a, for want of a better word, spectrum of comfortableness with themselves and with their interactions with other people. I've been mentoring someone recently, actually, who works in, not here at the Royal Free, but works in accident and emergency, wants to do that as a career, and is finding it really difficult to be authentic about himself and his sexuality, and is often assumed to be heterosexual and asked questions about his female partner. It's assumed to be a female partner, and he finds it very difficult to be authentic. So I think being visible is tremendously important.
Yeah, no, and I would put this, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I would put this challenge out to all of our leaders within the NHS who identify either as transgender, lesbian, gay, to really think hard about whether or not their openness about their sexuality at work can actually make it better for the next generation, so that they are comfortable and they don't face those same questions that your colleague that you've just spoken about, or ourselves early in our career. So I as part of these podcasts, I would put that challenge out to anybody listening. If you are a senior leader within the NHS and you identify as lesbian or gay, or with one of the gender characteristics, be confident to be open about it, because that's how we're going to support people in the future. I'll get off my high horse on that one. And I wanted to bring you, we've talked a lot about your experiences as working in the NHS and studying to be a doctor. But the other side of this is our service users. We know that there is a wealth of evidence to say that patients who identify as lesbian, gay can have poorer health outcomes, can feel quite isolated talking about their sexuality as a patient. And moving on from that, for our transgender community, even more so. Clearly, you work in a field where you will come across a lot of people from particularly gay men in HIV in London. But across the whole spectrum of medicine, what do you think it's like being a gay patient?
Oh, that's good. So there are a couple of trusts, I think, I'm pretty sure King's and Bart's was the other one, did some surveys about attitudes. Well, the Bart survey was about attitudes to patients with HIV. But I think the King's survey was about staff attitudes to LGBTQ plus patients generally, and really did reveal some quite stark findings. I think from a service user perspective, people do say it's very difficult to be open. Certainly, it's horrible here because you don't want to pick out, you know, individual groups or specialties. There are exemplars of fantastic practice, of course, across the NHS. But I certainly some older patients who've never been comfortable talking about their sexuality or gender identity find it very difficult to raise these issues in primary care or in emergency departments, for instance, or across wider hospital wards and outpatient services. So I think it remains the fact that there is a lot of assumption. I also think, I mean, we know sexual health services and HIV, you would hope, would be leaders in terms of making sure that they're inclusive and open. But I do think there are barriers to other LGBT patients receiving the appropriate care. And I think without the right use of language, the right role modeling, and the right challenging of assumptions, people actually they have opportunities for good healthcare that are missed. So we know they have screening opportunities that are missed. Things are not asked about mental health, about substance use, about over-the-counter hormone use, for instance, in some transgender groups. And so I still think there's a lot of work to be done in non-specialist, non-dedicated services, wider general services across the NHS to make sure that language is used appropriately and that assumptions are not made that could be harmful.
And of course, you know, outside of, you know, what the whole of medicine, you know, as I'm sure I'm not the oldest gay person that uses the NHS, but you know, there is a community of the older community who really probably feel much less comfortable than we do, but they're needing to access services, stroke services, geriatric services. That, you know, it's across the spectrum. What do you think? What would you ask of our individuals, our allies, our advocates, and our policymakers? You know, to actually, I suppose what I'm saying in a roundabout way is I want our leaders to realise that when they're designing services, that actually, you know, gender identity and sexuality should always be considered. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I often think, depending on local demographics and what your service area is, what you kind of need is some kind of level 1, 2, and 3 accreditation, don't you? I mean, if you're a dedicated gender identity service, then you should clearly be operating at level 3 with the most intense training and be the most open, inclusive service within the NHS. And then perhaps if you're working in primary care and you're not working in an area of, you know, a central metropolitan area, so you're not working in Brighton, Manchester, or central London, or maybe a rural environment, perhaps you want to be level 1. You know, you want to have some understanding of gender neutral pronouns and how to ask things sensitively and thinking about people's partners without making assumptions, perhaps how to signpost to sexual health and HIV testing. But you might not need the language and the skill set that you need of a level 3 service. And I think we should look at that kind of training and badging across NHS services.
Absolutely, and I think you know, the argument that, you know, in rural communities it's less common, but it's probably in many ways more important because those people can be even more isolated than people from the transgender and LGBT communities, because we all gravitate towards the big metropolitan cities for that reason, so that we can feel part of a community. So Tristan, you mentioned pronouns a moment ago, and I'm sure you're aware of the national campaign, the Little Words Big Impact, and I know you wear a badge in your work environment with your pronouns on, as do I. How important do you think it is for us within the NHS to be aware of pronouns and proactive about sharing them?
I think it's tremendously important because it creates a conversation not only with patients but also with colleagues about the importance of using pronouns, and it also establishes you as someone who's open to being a point of contact for people who may be questioning their own gender identity or who may need to have some advice about how best to access inclusive services. I mean, I identify as a cisgendered man. My natural pronouns would be he, him, but I've spoken to transgender colleagues within and without the NHS about using they, them as a pronoun. I didn't want to take up a kind of trans or non-binary space inappropriately, but actually their feedback was that that would be something that was very supportive if those were pronouns I was happy with. And so I do use he, him, they, them quite happily and interchangeably. And that in itself, for me, has been an interesting journey in terms of opening up conversations with people and representing and being an ally, I hope.
So, yeah, so you've expanded your use of your own pronouns to really support, well, I mean that's fantastic. I've not heard of somebody doing that before, but that's in terms of making your transgender community feeling welcome and safe and included. That must have had a fantastic impact for them. We could talk about this all day, but I suppose, we know there are problems within the NHS, both for patients and users, and we know what some of the solutions are. And as part of doing this awareness campaign, what I want to do is think about what our next steps are. So, our sort of call to action, our rallying campaign. What do you think we should do next? Both in the really big organisations and the NHS as a whole, but also more at a local level. If you could have 2 or 3 wishes that we could see change over the next however many months or longer, what do you think our priorities should be?
I think the big thing is really that institutions need to understand where their blocks are. And so I think it should be, we have mandatory EDI training as part of our annual mandatory training, but I think it's quite a token gesture, and I think people should have the ability to go above and beyond that training to reach what I've said before. You could be, a local champion for LGBTQ plus inclusion issues. You may be someone who's done a bit of extra training because you work in an environment like mine, or you may be someone who's done the level 1 training and is able to offer inclusive services at a basic level. But I think the important thing is knowing your own population. You've mentioned already that the number of people who are comfortable identifying as part of the gay or queer community or trans community within your own institution is quite low compared to what you'd expect. So I think there needs to be some in-depth work there to understand why that is and what the barriers and facilitators are to encourage better inclusion. I think we have to look at, sometimes we do still work in silos. And I'm very aware that here within my own HIV service, it's a very comfortable environment to be in, but we probably don't get out and about enough. So we need to be visible not only within our own Pride events and LGBTQ safe spaces, but also we need to be present at our grand rounds, talking about these issues, present at other trust events, talking about these issues and representing and being represented. I think also, just to conclude on, I don't have a lot to do with undergraduate medical education. I hear that things are a lot better, but I think it should be key that these issues are discussed very early on in medical school with an eye to all aspects of medicine, not only to encourage people to be better care providers, but also to encourage them to understand their fellow students in a much better, deeper, wider and more inclusive way.
Well, thank you, Tristan. I think that's a great way to finish the podcast. I am very grateful to you for providing your time, your thoughts, your insights, and I look forward to the journey to a better environment for our LGBTQ plus patients and staff in the future. Thanks again.
Thank you very much indeed.